Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'm Eric, and joining me is Anna.
Welcome. So, there's been a noticeable shift happening in global clinical trials, and it's not subtle anymore. Sponsors are actively looking beyond traditional trial hubs, not just experimenting, but committing. One region in particular that keeps coming up in these conversations is the GCC.
What's interesting is that this isn't just about geography. It's not simply sponsors saying, we need new locations. It's about a convergence of factors that suddenly make the GCC a serious strategic option for clinical development.
Exactly. For a long time, clinical trials followed a familiar pattern: North America, Western Europe, maybe parts of Asia. And while those regions are still critical, they're also facing increasing pressure. Patient recruitment challenges, longer timelines, higher costs, and in some cases, regulatory congestion.
And sponsors are feeling that pressure acutely right now. Development timelines are tighter, investor expectations are higher, and competition is intense. When a trial stalls because enrollment takes too long or operational complexity becomes overwhelming, that can have real downstream consequences.
That's where the GCC starts to enter the picture. Countries across the region have been investing heavily in healthcare infrastructure, research capabilities, and regulatory modernization. This isn't accidental. It's part of broader national strategies focused on becoming global hubs for healthcare and life sciences.
And what's different now compared to even 5 or 10 years ago is the level of maturity. We're not talking about emerging concepts. We're talking about established clinical research centers, internationally trained investigators, and regulatory authorities that are actively engaging with global sponsors.
One of the biggest drivers here is patient access. The GCC offers access to diverse patient populations that are often underrepresented in traditional trials. That diversity isn't just a nice to have anymore. Regulators and sponsors alike are increasingly focused on ensuring trial populations reflect real world use.
At the same time, many of these countries have centralized healthcare systems. That can streamline patient identification, recruitment, and follow up in ways that are much harder to achieve in fragmented systems.
And there's also speed. Sponsors are seeing faster startup timelines in certain GCC countries, especially when regulatory pathways are clearly defined and engagement starts early. When authorities are willing to have proactive discussions about protocol design, trial scope, and expectations, that changes the entire dynamic.
But it's important to say this clearly. Sponsors aren't moving trials to the Middle East because standards are lower. If anything, the opposite is true. Regulatory authorities in the GCC are focused on aligning with international standards, including ICH, GCP, and data integrity requirements.
That alignment is critical. Global sponsors need confidence that data generated in the region will be accepted by regulators elsewhere. And GCC authorities understand that credibility on the global stage depends on rigor, transparency, and consistency.
Another factor that often gets overlooked is investigator engagement. There's a growing base of investigators in the region who are eager to participate in global research, bring innovative therapies to their patients, and build long-term research programs. That enthusiasm matters. It affects trial execution, patient retention, and data quality.
And from the sponsor side, there's also a strategic element. Running trials in the Middle East can support broader market entry goals. Clinical development and commercialization strategies are becoming more integrated, and sponsors are thinking earlier about regions where they plan to launch or expand.
So when you put all of this together, improved infrastructure, regulatory alignment, patient access, investigator capability, and strategic market considerations, the shift starts to make sense. This isn't a temporary trend. It's part of a broader rebalancing of where and how global clinical trials are conducted.
Now, we're going to dig into what sponsors need to understand before expanding trials into the GCC. We'll talk about regulatory expectations, operational considerations, and common misconceptions that can trip organizations up if they're not prepared.
Because while the opportunity is real, success in the region requires thoughtful planning, local insight, and early engagement. And that's exactly what we'll explore as the conversation continues.
One of the first things sponsors often underestimate when they look at the GCC is how different the regulatory landscape can feel, even when it's aligned with global standards. On paper, the frameworks may reference ICH and GCP, but the way those expectations are applied locally can vary from country to country.
And that's where early engagement becomes essential. Sponsors who assume they can take a one-size-fits-all approach to submissions or timelines tend to run into friction. The organizations that succeed are the ones that invest time up front to understand local processes, documentation expectations, and review cycles.
Another important point is that the GCC isn't a single market. It's a group of countries with distinct regulatory authorities, healthcare systems, and levels of clinical research experience. Treating the region as homogeneous can lead to missed opportunities or unnecessary delays.
Exactly. Some countries may offer faster startup timelines for certain study types, while others may be better suited for later phase trials or specific therapeutic areas. Strategic site selection within the region matters just as much as the decision to enter the region at all.
Operational readiness is another area where planning makes a difference. Sponsors need to ensure CROs and local partners have on the ground experience in the GCC, not just global reach. Local expertise can make or break site activation, investigator communication, and compliance with national requirements.
And there's also the practical reality of trial logistics. Import and export of investigational products, lab samples, and devices can involve country-specific requirements that need to be mapped early. When those considerations are left until late in the planning process, timelines suffer.
Cultural context is another factor that's often overlooked. Patient engagement strategies that work in the US or Europe may not translate directly in the GCC. Understanding local norms, languages, and expectations is critical for recruitment and retention.
That's especially true when informed consent is involved. Clear communication, culturally appropriate materials, and investigator training all play a role in ensuring patients truly understand the study and their participation.
There's also a strong emphasis in the region on data integrity and oversight. Regulatory authorities are increasingly focused on inspection readiness, documentation quality, and sponsor accountability. This isn't a region where informal processes will slide under the radar.
And that level of scrutiny is intentional. GCC regulators are building trust with global counterparts, and that means demonstrating that trials conducted locally meet the same standards of rigor as those conducted anywhere else.
Another misconception is that expanding into the GCC automatically reduces costs. While there can be efficiencies, especially related to recruitment and centralized healthcare systems, sponsors should approach the region as a value driven decision, not just a cost cutting one.
The real value often comes from speed, data quality, and access to patient populations that would otherwise be difficult to reach. Those benefits can outweigh cost considerations when development timelines are critical.
What we're seeing more of now are sponsors integrating the GCC into their global trial strategies earlier, rather than adding it as a last minute solution when enrollment stalls elsewhere. That shift changes how trials are designed and managed from the start.
And it also changes internal conversations. Regulatory, clinical operations, quality, and market access teams need to be aligned early on. Successful expansion into the GCC is rarely driven by a single function. It's a cross-functional effort.
In the next part of this conversation, we'll start to get more specific. We'll talk about what sponsors should be asking regulators early, how to assess readiness internally, and what common pitfalls to avoid when expanding trials into the region.
Because while the momentum is real, the organizations that succeed are the ones that treat GCC expansion as a strategic initiative, not a reactive one.
At this point, the question most sponsors are asking is where to start. The interest in this region is there, but translating that interest into an executable clinical trial strategy can feel overwhelming, especially for organizations that haven't operated in the region before. Why,
A good starting point is internal readiness. Before engaging regulators or sites, sponsors need to assess whether their own teams are aligned. That includes clinical operations, regulatory, quality, supply chain, and data management. If those groups aren't working from the same assumptions, expansion into a new region becomes unnecessarily complicated.
One of the most important early steps is regulatory strategy mapping. Sponsors should clearly define which countries within the GCC are being considered, what phase of development is involved, and how those studies fit into the global program. That clarity shapes everything that follows.
Early dialogue with regulatory authorities can be a significant advantage. In several GCC countries, regulators are open to pre-submission discussions, scientific advice meetings, or informal consultations. These conversations help set expectations and reduce surprises later in the process.
And those discussions aren't just about timelines, they're an opportunity to align on protocol design, endpoints, patient populations, and data requirements. When regulators understand the sponsor's objectives early, reviews tend to be more efficient.
Site readiness is another critical piece. Sponsors need to evaluate not only whether sites have the right infrastructure, but whether they have experience with similar trial designs, technologies, and reporting requirements. That includes familiarity with electronic systems, remote monitoring, and global sponsor expectations.
Training also plays a major role. Even highly capable sites may require additional training to align with a sponsor's quality systems, SOPs, and documentation practices. Investing in that training up front can prevent issues during monitoring visits and inspections.
From a quality perspective, sponsors should treat GCC sites the same way they treat sites anywhere else in the world. That means clear documentation, robust oversight, and consistent processes. Lowering standards in a new region is one of the fastest ways to create compliance risk.
And in reality, most GCC regulators expect that same level of rigor. Many authorities are increasing inspection activity and strengthening enforcement mechanisms. Sponsors should assume that inspections are not a question of if, but when.
Another area to plan carefully is data flow. Sponsors need to ensure that data collected in the GCC integrates seamlessly into global systems, meets privacy requirements, and supports downstream submissions. Data consistency and traceability are essential for global acceptance.
There's also the human element. Building strong relationships with investigators, site staff, and local partners takes time, but it pays dividends. Open communication, responsiveness, and respect for local expertise go a long way in ensuring trial success.
We're also seeing sponsors rethink how they structure CRO relationships in the region. Some are opting for global CROs with strong regional teams, while others are pairing global oversight with specialized local partners. There's no single right model, but the choice should be intentional.
As the GCC continues to mature as a clinical research destination, competition for sites and patients is increasing. Sponsors that engage early and build long term relationships are often better positioned than those that enter the region opportunistically.
Now we'll bring this all together. We'll talk about what success actually looks like for sponsors in the GCC, how to avoid common mistakes, and what the next few years are likely to bring as the region's role in global clinical trials continues to expand.
As sponsors gain more experience in the Middle East, the conversation starts to shift from whether the region is viable to how to scale presence there responsibly. That's an important transition because early success can create momentum, but without a long term strategy, that momentum can be hard to sustain.
One of the biggest risks at this stage is treating GCC trials as isolated pilots. Running a single successful study is valuable, but the real impact comes when sponsors integrate the region into their broader development programs. That means thinking beyond one protocol and considering how future studies, indications, or phases could fit into a regional roadmap.
Regulatory consistency plays a major role here. Sponsors benefit from documenting lessons learned from early engagements with authorities and applying those insights across subsequent submissions. Over time, that institutional knowledge becomes a competitive advantage.
There's also a growing emphasis on inspection readiness as sponsors scale activity in the region. As trial volume increases, so does regulatory scrutiny. Sponsors should ensure that quality oversight models are scalable, not just sufficient for one or two sites.
That includes clear accountability structures. Everyone involved in the trial, from global teams to local partners, needs to understand roles, responsibilities, and escalation pathways. Ambiguity in governance is one of the most common sources of compliance gaps.
Technology can support this, but only when it's implemented thoughtfully. Remote monitoring tools, centralized data review, and digital quality systems can help sponsors maintain visibility across geographically dispersed sites. However, those tools need to be aligned with local practices and regulatory expectations.
Another area where sponsors are becoming more intentional is talent development. Building regional expertise, whether through dedicated internal teams or long term partnerships, reduces reliance on ad hoc support and improves consistency across studies.
And from the investigator perspective, sponsors that invest in long term relationships often see better outcomes. Investigators are more likely to prioritize studies from sponsors they trust, understand, and have worked with successfully in the past.
Market considerations are also becoming more integrated into clinical planning. For many sponsors, conducting trials in the GCC supports future commercialization goals, payer engagement, and real world evidence generation. Clinical development is no longer happening in isolation from market strategy.
That integration requires coordination across functions that don't always work closely together. Clinical, regulatory, quality, medical affairs, and commercial teams all need visibility into how regional trial activity supports broader organizational objectives.
Looking ahead, the role of the GCC in global clinical research is likely to continue expanding. Government investment, regulatory modernization, and population growth all point toward sustained momentum rather than a temporary surge.
At the same time, expectations will continue to rise. Regulators, investigators, and patients will expect sponsors to operate at a high level of professionalism, transparency, and accountability. Success in the region will depend on meeting those expectations consistently.
At this stage, sponsors also start asking how to measure success in the GCC beyond simple enrollment metrics. Speed matters, but it's not the only indicator. Data quality, protocol adherence, patient retention, and inspection outcomes are just as important when evaluating whether expansion into the region is truly working.
One thing that becomes clear quickly is that governance models need to evolve as regional activity grows. Informal oversight might work for a single study, but once multiple trials or countries are involved, sponsors need structured governance frameworks that support consistency and accountability.
That includes clear escalation pathways when issues arise. Whether it's a protocol deviation, a supply delay, or a data integrity concern, teams need to know exactly how decisions are made and who owns resolution. In a multi country environment, ambiguity can slow response times and increase risk.
Risk based quality management is particularly relevant here. Sponsors should identify region specific risks early and adjust monitoring and oversight strategies accordingly. That might mean increased early monitoring visits, targeted data reviews, or additional investigator training during startup.
Another important consideration is alignment with ethics committees and institutional review boards. Review processes can differ across the GCC, and timelines may vary depending on the institution and study type. Building realistic expectations into the project plan helps prevent frustration and last minute adjustments.
Transparency with stakeholders is also critical. Investigators, sites, and partners need a clear understanding of sponsor expectations, reporting requirements, and communication norms. Consistent messaging helps build trust and reduces misunderstandings that can affect trial performance.
There's also growing interest in real world evidence and post market studies in the region. As healthcare systems in the GCC become more digitized, opportunities to generate high quality observational data are expanding. Sponsors who establish strong relationships during clinical development are often better positioned to leverage those opportunities later.
From a patient perspective, access to innovative therapies is a powerful motivator. Many patients in the region are eager to participate in trials that offer cutting edge treatments and contribute to advancing care locally. Sponsors that prioritize patient centric approaches tend to see stronger engagement.
That patient centric mindset also ties back to reputation. How sponsors conduct trials in the GCC influences how they're perceived by regulators, healthcare providers, and the broader community. Ethical conduct, transparency, and long term commitment matter.
Another theme that's emerging is collaboration. We're seeing more public-private partnerships, academic collaborations, and cross-border initiatives designed to strengthen the clinical research ecosystem. Sponsors that engage collaboratively rather than transactionally often gain deeper insight and stronger support.
As the region continues to mature, competition among sponsors will increase. The sites and investigators with the strongest track records will be in high demand. Early engagement and relationship building can become a differentiator in securing participation.
Ultimately, expanding clinical trials into the GCC is not about finding an alternative to traditional regions. It's about building a more resilient, diverse, and globally representative development strategy. When done thoughtfully, it strengthens both scientific outcomes and organizational capability.
In the final part of this conversation, we'll distill everything we've discussed into a set of practical takeaways. What sponsors should prioritize first, what to avoid, and how to approach GCC expansion as a long term strategic investment rather than a short term solution.
It's worth stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. The movement of clinical trials into the GCC isn't a short-term workaround or a reaction to challenges elsewhere. It reflects a broader shift in how global sponsors think about clinical development.
At its core, this shift is about building more resilient, inclusive, and efficient trial ecosystems. Sponsors are recognizing that relying on the same regions and patient pools limits flexibility and slows progress. Expanding into the Middle East opens new possibilities, but only when it's approached with intention.
One of the clearest takeaways is that success in the GCC starts long before the first site is activated. It begins with strategy. Sponsors need to define why the region matters for their development programs and how it fits into long-term goals, not just immediate enrollment needs.
Preparation is equally critical. Understanding regulatory expectations, mapping country specific processes, and aligning internal teams up front can prevent many of the issues that derail studies later on. The sponsors that struggle are often the ones that underestimate the planning required.
Another key point is the importance of partnership. Strong relationships with regulators, investigators, CROs, and local stakeholders aren't optional. They're foundational. Trust, transparency, and consistent engagement create the conditions for smoother execution and better outcomes.
Quality and compliance remain non negotiable. Expanding into a new region doesn't change global expectations for data integrity, patient safety, or inspection readiness. In fact, it often heightens them. Sponsors should assume that trials conducted in the GCC will be held to the same, if not higher, level of scrutiny as those elsewhere.
There's also a mindset shift happening within sponsor organizations. Successful expansion into the GCC requires cross-functional collaboration. Clinical, regulatory, quality, supply chain, and commercial teams all need to be aligned around shared objectives and realistic expectations.
From an operational standpoint, sponsors should think beyond individual trials and toward building repeatable models. Documenting lessons learned, refining processes, and developing internal expertise enables organizations to scale activity in the region more efficiently over time.
Looking ahead, the trajectory is clear. Investment in healthcare infrastructure, regulatory modernization, and research capability across the GCC is continuing. As a result, the region's role in global clinical trials is likely to grow, not shrink.
At the same time, competition will increase. Sponsors that move early, engage thoughtfully, and commit to long term presence will be better positioned than those that approach the region opportunistically or reactively.
For sponsors considering this move, the message is simple. The GCC represents a meaningful opportunity, but it rewards preparation, respect for local context, and strategic intent. When those elements are in place, the region can become a powerful component of a global clinical development strategy.
that's the real evolution we're seeing. Not just new trial locations, but a more globally connected approach to clinical research, one that reflects the realities of today's development landscape and the expectations of patients, regulators, and sponsors.
And with that, we'll leave you with this thought. The future of clinical trials isn't confined to one region or one model. It's global, it's collaborative, and increasingly, it includes the Middle East as a key player in advancing innovation. Visit emmainternational.com to learn more or contact us at info@emmainternational.com.